Hi, Anand.
Hi, Ankit, it's me. I'm
Oh,
just trying to figure out how to. We're trying to stream this live on YouTube.
oh,
So,
that's great.
I think it's working. Just a minute. Let me just fit. Uh, yeah, it is.
Yeah, I can see it. Oh, I can see it being live here. So yeah, Huzaifa is also here. Hi, Huzaifa. You're muted. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Anand. Where's Anand? Oh, that's Alex. Hi.
Hi, Huzaifa.
Yeah, so, how's it
How are
going?
you? Yeah, it's going well. So I just created the what's it called? The live streaming link. I'll just share it here, so you can also share it.
On YouTube also.
Yeah.
That's good.
Live.
So Alex, just one thing. So how would we proceed? How long should it be, this thing?
So about an hour.
Okay.
We'll begin with what's it called? One of us will introduce both of you, and then Ankit can just speak for about 10 minutes about just let everyone know what the project is about, and then what's it called? And then you can just start discussing, and then we end with opening it up for questions for everyone.
Okay.
Makes sense?
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Questions should be like how long? Like 10, 15 minutes after that?
Like 15 minutes, 20 minutes, sort of. How much ever questions there are, like we'll just gauge accordingly. Mostly we just want to go until 7:10.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah. So I'll just share these links on our social media things.
Alex, has it ever happened? Like people have unwanted people have like started.
No,
trolling
nothing.
Because I have been to a couple of talks where
Oh.
people randomly start some music or something like just to disturb and all of them have been, like talks about anti-caste issues and so on. So I think,
Seriously?
yeah,
I
I
didn't know
have
this.
been to a couple, just two. But yeah, that has happened. Like people unmute. I mean, someone unmutes themselves and start playing some random music or something like that.
Wow.
Yeah, that has happened in the past. So
this has never happened on any of our events. Like we've
okay.
always just randomly shared the Zoom link and
Yeah.
then we just get emails saying, "Oh, you have done this."
Yeah. Hopefully it won't happen. But
Yeah.
the talk that I had attended, one was of Oxford University, and there there was one event where one person had of course the person was removed by the host later. But yeah, that had happened, and it was very. I think that was like the targeted this thing. Since this was a anti-caste event, someone is targeting it unnecessarily.
Yeah. And it's like more high profile than what we do, no? Like usually ours goes into circles.
It was.
Yeah. So
and
I
with
guess
diaspora events, it's already like more pronounced nowadays.
Exactly.
Hi, Anand.
Hi there, Ankit. Jai Bhim to you.
Jai Bhim.
So, any disruptor, please, Ravi Prakash. Okay, we will disrupt this meeting ourselves.
Yeah.
Hi, Huzaifa. Hello.
Hi, Koral.
Hi. Sorry. Hi, Anand. How are you?
Hi, there you are, Huzaifa.
So, how are things, Anand?
Good. And I heard from the Hindu person, that they're
Yeah,
going to carry it in May.
yeah, they've been postponing it for some time. I don't know why.
Yeah, it's one of not really one of the most. I mean, whether you publish a book called the Brahmin or the Shudra, I think the Hindu will, or the Hindu. Your book is called the Hindu. They'll be a bit scared, no? I don't know.
Maybe. I don't know what's to be so scared about.
To bring others in on the conversation. Sorry, they're thinking we're having a private chat, then we should call each other. So Alex, Ankit, Koral, and Ravi Prakash. We don't know who you are, but you are in the conversation. So, and AD. Yeah. So there's a book we published. There's a set of, I was thinking from now on, Alex. I mean, one of the things one keeps thinking and learning from is like instead of just saying, here's a link, this is the talk, what about a set of readings each time we put out 10 days ahead? Like some of those are even Navayana books, for instance, the Shudra, which is what Huzaifa was commissioned by the Hindu to review. And then the Hindu reviewer couldn't make sense of the review or of the book through the review or something. And they said they're going to get a copy to read it and then decide on the veracity of the review. It was very vague. I don't know, Huzaifa might know better.
I also don't know what she meant.
So I said, good, read the book. Then Huzaifa decided that if she did read the book, then she'll be even more confused.
Yeah, definitely. Because my review was just, I did not at all add anything new. I just straight away summarized most of the findings.
I know, it was so
That's-
wonderful, simply
like-
and neatly written.
Yeah, that's all. And she was she
And
was
it
very
was,
puzzled.
yeah, as if Huzaifa had it also felt like you had done it for the sake of Hindu. Like let's keep it simple.
Yeah,
So,
basically that's what I did.
You didn't even give yourself full rein to the possibilities of that you can actually do with the book. I felt, so it was more the Hindu review, and yet they found it hard to digest. So Hora, they said, I suggested May 15th is a grand day to do it because Annihilation of Caste was published on that day in 1936. Anyway,
publishing.
so yeah. So Huzaifa has become part of the conspiracy called Navayana. So we enlist him for this event, for which we are grateful.
Yeah, I'm also very happy to be part of it.
Yeah.
It's great reading Ankit's work. I've seen Ankit around for a long time, but we
are hostel mates. I mean,
yeah,
just wanted to let you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very small circle.
Yeah.
So despite the tweet, despite Zoom warning us, do we have a quorum? I think so.
We have 7 people,
Yeah, 3 is a crowd.
of which 5 is us.
So let's wait politely for another couple of minutes, like nice
Yeah.
people. So
yeah, we can wait. A few
there is Chandravan Yadav, Daisy Zakaria.
Oh, and I was just reading your chapters, Ankit, and you also found Jalal al-Haq useful in some way, no?
Yes.
There are references to him.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm planning to write a long form article on him for Caravan.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Did you
On all
pitch
his
it to
books.
them?
No, I have not. Actually, I was going to talk to you about it. I haven't started, but I could perhaps talk to him one or email him or however.
Email somebody in Caravan, you mean?
No, I mean, I've already confirmed with them. I mean, to the Professor Huck.
Okay, you want access to his other books.
Yeah, no, I have his other book. Maybe I could speak with him at some point.
Sure. Did you get in touch? Not yet, no?
No, not yet. I was
Okay.
going to ask
So
you.
the best way to do it with him is via WhatsApp.
Okay.
He's a very old school person who does only WhatsApp, and
Okay.
and all the email queries, nothing. He doesn't look at email. He has to go to some center. Somebody has to look at email, look up. It's like all.
How old is he? He's very mysterious.
He's mysterious. So he's actually not interested in social interaction. He's not interested in being accused of being in the Dalit Bahujan Ambedkar Periyar Phule dialogue network at all. अरे ये सब क्या है? तुम कुछ कर रहे हो? ये सब he is like gone to these cortex, looked at certain things, and come up with conclusions and really, arrows of thought which share a lot of things with, say, Ambedkar and Pule in a broad way, not in terms of what he would call identity politics, etc. But his approach is mine is a work of philosophy, and it's pretty useless. You don't need to republish it. Why are you bothering me? And then you have to convince him to say this is an incredible piece of work, and then you have to let us go to
Well,
town
I'm
with
glad
it.
you republished it.
Yeah, so he's somebody kind of, I think, very sure of the fact that he's put out something that's a nice idea, but he's very diffident. He's not known at all. And people, like when I approached Romila Thapar and said, "Have you read this work?" and presented her with a copy, she said it is not exactly up her street, like she would say with anything about Pule and Ambedkar. It's never been on their, they've never been on that street. So for me, Huck represents a kind of a scholarship that, again, if you want to get in touch with him and simply talk to him, I'll pass you his number. I would suggest you do that after your review appears in the Hindu. That might reassure him. So yeah, talk to him, but he's not open to conversations. I've had only 1 or 2 phone calls with him. The rest of it is he even answered everything by hand and sent pictures on WhatsApp.
Okay.
Then when you send him the proof, he flipped a bit over how we used commas or how he wanted us to use commas and such things. And he's a fussy old man who would say, I don't want to do any work. Why are you making me work on this now? You see what I mean?
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
Alex happily पीछे बैठ के ये कर रहा था कि he wasn't dealing with Jalalul Haq. It's very difficult to deal with Jalalul Haq, I realized. Very old school and open only
His
to...
theory is also kind of old school. It's
Yeah.
like...
One of the people whom we approached to kind of possibly endorse the book, many rejected. Romila rejected. Who is this other person you chose?
I forget.
Bengali scholar.
Yeah.
Caste पे जो लिखा है.
Yeah, the guy who wrote this one.
Sumit Guha.
Sumit Guha.
Yeah, we should say Sumit Guha. Sumit Guha was somebody who said this is what caught in some other world. Yeah, this is like all passe kind of stuff. So, but yeah, so that has been the kind of...
Yeah, I mean, I get, so basically I looked him up. So he's in philosophy department. He wrote his PhD on Bertrand Russell. So this, I think his work that at least I've read is not really concerned so much with, academic publishing or all of that. It's a very idiosyncratic work. It's very interesting also because you can't, I don't think you should agree with everything he says, but there are certain thoughts being developed that do need to, that would not fit into an academic context, first of all. And second,
in fact, I think Chandraban should read it because his dismissal of Buddhism at a certain level is something that's very interesting, and yet he has a point. But again, he is somebody who would never approach it through a political lens. That's why he says that I have nothing to do with this Ambedkar, Periyar, Pule kind of stuff. I'm looking at this grand idea. For him, an interlocutor is possibly Nehru or Savarkar even. He has worked on Savarkar. He has worked on Golwalkar, these kind of people. It's the right which he's amused by, and he's very gentle in the way he pricks their balloon. So I would really look forward to you working on his thing. So should we formally start? About 10 people, ठीक है?
Yeah, and it's streaming also, so...
Sure. So people may be watching it on YouTube, you mean?
Yeah,
okay.
Could be.
So for those of you, the 3 or 4 who are new to us, I am Anand, the publisher of Navayana. I'm going to hand this over immediately to Alex. Alex and Korul, yeah. So primarily it's going to be a conversation between Huzaifa and Ankit, right? So Alex, who is also signed as Anandesh. So over to you. There are 2 Anands on the screen.
We'll start with Korul.
Okay, Korul, over to you.
Yeah, I'm just going to introduce Ankit and Huzaifa. So Ankit Kawade is currently a doctoral student in political science at the Center for Political Studies in JNU. He's also a Navayana Dalit History Fellow. And the working title of his manuscript is The Genius of the Chandala and the Gospel of the Superman, Nietzsche, Ambedkar, and the Conflict of Interpretations. And Huzaifa Omair Siddiqi is a thinker and writer who's done important work on caste, politics, and philosophy. He was awarded a PhD from JNU in 2020. His work is available on Scroll, The Wire, and other major outlets. So, Alex, do you want to take over?
So we begin with Ankit. Ankit, if you could just introduce your work, and then we can jump into the discussion.
Yeah. What I broadly suggest is, if you don't mind, Ankit, that you give us a short overview of your work, and then I would rather see a kind of a dialogue emerge between instead of long discourses from each of you. So let's keep it in the spirit of dialogue. And if anybody here, even in the middle of things, after a person finishes the point, wants to intervene and ask Huzaifa, you moderate it, raising of hand or whatever form of address that's required to intervene. So over to you, Ankit.
Yeah, thank you, Koral, Anand, and Alex, and of course Huzaifa for being here. This book project is a substantially revised and expanded version of what I worked on during my MPhil degree, where I tried to look at and analyze Nietzsche and Ambedkar's interpretations of the Hindu law book Manusmriti. So the book project currently, is divided into three parts. The first part concerns Nietzsche's reading of the Manusmriti. The second part concerns Ambedkar's reading of the Manusmriti, and the third part concerns Ambedkar's reading of Nietzsche. That is how I wish to sort of complete the arc, so to say, which begins with Nietzsche's reading of the Manusmriti and sort of ends with Ambedkar's reading of Nietzsche and what he has to say about Nietzsche's reading of the Manusmriti, whether it is accurate, not accurate, and so on and so forth. Let me also, speak very briefly about the title, because, the title at first impression gives this effect that, okay, the first part of the title must be from, say, Ambedkar, and the second part of the title must be from Nietzsche. So the genius of the Chandala, which is the first part of the title, is actually coming from Nietzsche's writings, his book, Twilight of the Idols. And the Gospel of the Superman part of the title is actually coming from Ambedkar's works, Philosophy of Hinduism. So in the title itself, I wanted to, indicate a sort of historical encounter, and between Nietzsche's usage of the word Chandala and Ambedkar's usage of the word Superman, there is already established a kind of a philosophical entanglement that I'm trying to disentangle through this book project. So very briefly, this is what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, so of one of the few people to have read parts of this work at least is me. So I can just say that it is, of the 5 chapters that I read of the total 7, it's a very promising work, and I think it's bringing together a lot of things that, people would not dare to bring together, in a certain sense. Because if you think about the title itself, it has 3 major thinkers. It has Nietzsche, it has Manu, and there's Ambedkar, right? No matter what we say about Manu, he is a major thinker, right? In a certain sense, whoever Manu was, whether he was one person or many. So the thing that actually was very interesting is that all 3 of these are not just individuals in a certain sense, right? I mean, they are individuals, but they are also traditions. Like like Nietzsche, for example, is an entire, if you can look at the history of Western philosophy in 20th century, Nietzsche is one of the major figures in that tradition. Like all of the big names you can think of in continental philosophy are readers of Nietzsche, whether it's Heidegger, Derrida, Deleuze, Foucault, all of them. So the entirety of 20th century philosophy is very much Nietzschean in spirit. Secondly, of course, we know what the Manuvadi tradition is. We are living in it. We are unwilling participants in this Manusmriti tradition, right? But in a certain sense, we are willing participants in an Ambedkarite or an Ambedkar tradition. So the question that I found very interesting in Ankit's work is, like, what do you do when you bring together these three traditions? Like, this is my question to you, Ankit. Like, when you're bringing together these three traditions, like Nietzsche, Manu, and Ambedkar, and at one point it might seem like they're so disparate, they're so different. What is the, first of all, what made you want to bring them together in the first place? And secondly, what is the nature of this bringing together? Like, is it a kind of confluence? Are you trying to bring them together to say, okay, look at these people, they all can happily inhabit some kind of discursive field? Or are you trying to bring them together to form some kind of antagonism, some kind of, you can say, productive antagonism? And if so, then what are you trying to produce out of that? That adversarial, that kind of conflict that you're trying to engender?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question for a start, because uh, I actually did not plan this work. My MPhil was in the beginning, because I was also lost in a way about what to research exactly. My MPhil was about a very tedious topic on the Ambedkar Gandhi debate, but later it turned into this, because I had read Nietzsche during my bachelor's, where I had taken German for my optionals. So I did read some of Nietzsche during that time, and I remembered that there were a lot of references to the Manusmriti when I read The Antichrist, for instance, during my bachelor's. And I was just, I had been admitted to my MPhil degree, and I was just reading philosophy of Hinduism. And I had read it before, but this time Ambedkar's references to Nietzsche really struck me for the first time as having, a lot of uh, as being of a lot of consequence, because I was thinking, oh, I mean, Ambedkar has been usually studied along. So who have been Ambedkar's intellectual interlocutors, if we have to, count them? So Gandhi is, of course, I think the most dominant interlocutor, along with whom Ambedkar has been studied in the academia. I think the second person would be Dewey, and of course, recent work produced by a lot of promising scholars have tried to bring Ambedkar into conversation with many other thinkers whom he did not directly study. So, for instance, Walter Benjamin, Foucault, Agamben, Gramsci. There are so many examples. So I thought that, okay, this is a really promising area to research and to delve deeper. What exactly was so while reading philosophy of Hinduism, the entire substance of Ambedkar's references to Nietzsche in that text is about how he misread the Manusmriti, or how he misinterpreted the Manusmriti. So that is really the germ of why I became interested in this project in the first place. And to be honest, I had no such inkling for dabbling with religion, and especially Hindu religion, or the texts of Sanskrit antiquity. Also because I have no Sanskrit training or anything like that. So it is only via Ambedkar's references to Nietzsche that I was also, perhaps even unwillingly drawn towards studying the Manusmriti. And I think that also is that is also in a way important, because I feel people who are doing Ambedkar scholarship, or people who are doing anti-caste scholarship, must return to these texts over and over again, because these texts are what, a text like the Manusmriti, for instance, is what formulated or is what instigated Ambedkar's terrible revulsion against both the Hindu society as well as his desire for an egalitarian society to come. So this is what really began my interest. And what am I trying to do with these three traditions exactly? I am, in a way, trying to look at their entanglements exactly. So what Nietzsche, what is in the Manusmriti that Nietzsche finds interesting was something that I, and this is something that I hope to discuss with you over our conversation. What is it that Nietzsche found interesting in the Manusmriti, and what exactly did Ambedkar find interesting in Nietzsche? And as it exists, Nietzsche really liked the Manusmriti because held some kind of a political promise of inequality that he was, rallying against in an increasingly egalitarian Europe. And of course, Ambedkar did not like Nietzsche's praise of the Manusmriti when he's discussing it in the philosophy of Hinduism. So yes, as it exists, there is already a sense of antagonism that exists between, Ambedkar and Nietzsche's interpretations of the Manusmriti. So I begin from there, and I end with, what a spoiler alert, I end with suggesting that there are nonetheless important philosophical points where Ambedkar and Nietzsche share a lot of, important political ground. And that is something that I do towards the end of the book. So the very last chapter is about how there are certain philosophical common ground between these two thinkers, even if on the surface there is absolutely no sense of reconciliation. Nietzsche really liked the Manusmriti, really praised it in his writings, and Ambedkar also criticized Nietzsche very, very explicitly in his own work. So yeah.
Yeah, and this is a great way to talk about it, because I do think, yes, there are lots of similarities, but they're not superficial. They're not on the surface. They're not just visible. You open Nietzsche and you open Ambedkar and you see, oh, they're saying the same thing. But there is a kind of similarity that you actually trace, that your work is trying to trace out. And that's, I think, at least this is what my reading is, that both of them are non-Brahmanical in their own way. In a certain sense, Nietzsche, who is obviously someone who advocates inequality, who advocates a kind of strident anti-egalitarianism, but his is a non-Brahmanical anti-egalitarianism, right? In a certain sense, Ambedkar has a non-Brahmanical egalitarianism. So now that's a question, like, in what way is Nietzsche's non-Brahmanism, how does it still tend towards anti-egalitarianism? Because that creates a real antagonism between Ambedkar and Nietzsche there, because it's not like one of them is Brahmanical, the other is not Brahmanical. Both of them are non-Brahmanical, right? So now what do we do with them? That is the question, because I don't have the last 2 chapters of your work. So, it would be interesting to know what you want to do with this kind of antagonism.
True. As I also try to portray, this sort of contradiction exists in Nietzsche's own writings. So for instance, in his published works like The Antichrist and The Twilight of the Idols, he very explicitly is praising the Manusmriti, but at the same time, Nietzsche is the same thinker who is the one of the most important critics of what he called priestly morality, or any sort of a religious system or moral system based on the supremacy of the priest. So everything that he writes against Christianity can be, viewed through this lens of him being against priestly moralities. Lacan also has this very interesting theory about Nietzsche's father himself being a pastor, a Christian pastor. And there are a lot of, those resonances as well, because Nietzsche's hatred towards the priest can also be taken as Nietzsche's hatred towards his own father and towards his own origin and so on. But I don't want to go into that now. But yeah, there is this big contradiction existing in Nietzsche's own writings, where he is anti, and he of course uses the name Brahmin in a lot of instances. So when referring to the priest. So there is that big contradiction, and I try to analyze that in my work as well. How does one reconcile Nietzsche's praise of the Manusmriti with his anti-priesthood position? So that is very difficult, and I write as much that is not reconcilable, when we are trying to think about this whole position of what to do with inegalitarianism, where a social order still does not give a respectable position to the priest, for example, as is his opinion that all religions tend to give that supremacist position to the figure of the priest, and so on and so forth. So yeah, that reconciliation is very much, I also struggle with that sort of a reconciliation. In fact, I point out that this is a big contradiction in Nietzsche's own writings. And what exactly does this contradiction yield to? So in my work, I've tried to look at Nietzsche's, so that should be the corollary of Nietzsche's hatred against the priest. It's very interesting that Nietzsche is fascinated by the term Chandala from the Manusmriti. And that is what I am also pointing towards, that it is the category of the Chandala that is that Nietzsche is fascinated by in the entire text of the Manusmriti. And this is actually the paradigmatic concept that he himself describes it as a concept, a begriff, that he takes from this book and uses it for his own philosophical purposes. So it is very and of course scholars like Patrick Olivelle and Wendy Doniger have pointed out that the reason the Manusmriti is a Brahmanical text is because one of the effects of the Brahminism of these texts is that actually these texts carry very little on the social class of the Shudras and the Chandalas. The bulk of the verses in the Manusmriti, especially when it's related to the social classes, are to the Brahmins, which should be obvious for anybody. So this is really interesting, no? In a text that is almost entirely about Brahmins, Nietzsche finds the category of the Chandala more interesting rather than the figure of the Brahmin, and he uses it for various purposes. So yeah, that is where one can perhaps locate the point of Nietzsche's own contradictions as he's reading the Manusmriti. And of course, several scholars have also analyzed how his descriptions of the Chandala are themselves very inaccurate, historically inaccurate. But I take those into account, but I also try to show that these accounts, Nietzsche's account of the Chandala might be historically inaccurate, but is philosophically thought-provoking. That is something that I'm trying to push my direction towards. So yeah, I hope I have answered your question
and like this does bring us to like a very interesting point. Like you do, like in the first chapter of your book, you do say that there is, like, Nietzsche takes this concept of the Chandala and you use a special term for it. You say it becomes generically useful or generic usability.
Yes.
Right. So it's the kind, and this is what I think you mean by it, that it can be used in any kind of context for any kind of purpose that he feels it is apt at that point of time, right? So for example, at some points of time he will refer to the Chandala as someone who is completely, in a very pejorative terms, but also at the end of the chapter you mentioned that he relates this the nature of the Chandala to the artist himself, to Nietzsche himself, right? So this is a very interesting thing about Nietzsche, that he does not completely just deny the Chandala anything. He also does try to retrieve something from it, right? And do you think that brings him close to Ambedkar's project? Because not any other kind of imagination, they have nothing in common, right? But Ambedkar is also trying to retrieve something from the past. Like you write in the third or fourth chapter that it's a historicizing gesture, right? And while Nietzsche is not a historicizing gesture, he does not at all go into what was the real status of the Chandala in or Manu's time, or how untouchability actually exists in India. For him, the Chandala is a concept. It's a concept that he wants to use to put forth his point. It's kind of a literary device, It's not really anything more than that. But at the same time, this literary device becomes very integral to his entire, his entire rhetoric, his entire philosophy, right? And I think you've isolated that very beautifully. Like you've isolated that, the importance or the significance of the Chandala and Nietzsche very beautifully, because there is so much that has been missed in this debate, because people have just said, like you write, people have just said, oh, he's actually just misread Manusmriti. He's not understood what the Chandala is, or people have accused him of being Brahmanical for, saying that the Chandala is it's a bad state of, existence. But the question that was like actually like for me is that basically, for example, Nietzsche is operating in a kind of world or kind of domain where his opponent is the Christian priest, right? And the Christian priest for him is the one who's advocating egalitarianism, right? Someone who's the mouthpiece of egalitarianism, for someone who says that everyone is equal before God. While for Ambedkar, the priest is very different kind of priest, right? For Ambedkar, the priest is the one who's keeping us from being equal, right? So how does that meld in? Because then the it's not just the Chandala who becomes like a kind of site of contestation, but also the figure of the priest itself, right? In Ambedkar and Nietzsche.
True. I mean, so coming to the first point, I mean, uh, so far as I read, there were I observed a sort of a scholarly consensus that okay, the category of the Chandala is mostly pejoratively used in Nietzsche's writing. So, for instance, he describes Christianity as a Chandala religion. He describes Saint Paul as a Chandala apostle, and so on and so forth. So there are various range of usages that he makes of this generic name, as I call it in the chapter. So what I tried to point towards was that Nietzsche also felt a certain almost aesthetic affinity to the figure of the Chandala, because at one place in his writings, for instance, the Twilight of the Idols, he says that every genius carries the mark of the Chandala on his brow. So what does he exactly mean by that? He means that every genius in a particular environment where uh, egalitarianism has become the norm, and what exactly does he think are the effects of egalitarianism? So for instance, he argues, I mean, we can have our disagreements with his view, but this is what he argues. He thinks that a society which for which I mean, a society which places the value of equality as its highest value is going to uh, destroy the uh, destroy the conditions wherein artistic geniuses are born. So according to his view, in a thoroughly democratized society like Western Europe, the figure of the genius, the figure of the artist, the figure of the musician is always at the margin, because he thinks that in uh, critical theorists like Adorno and Horkheimer had a term for this. In a massified society, in a society where the means of culture industry have become thoroughly massified, the figure of the musician, the figure of I mean, all these artistic aesthetic geniuses carry very little value. Where you might see a politician being of a higher value, you might see some kind of a more quote unquote entertainer, filament or something like that, to represent a higher value. So Nietzsche is really railing against all this. He's saying that the value of high art, the value of high genius is thoroughly lowered in a society which only cares about equality in the man in the understanding of same value. So everything has same value, something like that. So I am trying to point out that Nietzsche is still trying to take something positive from the word Chandala by saying that the artists have been reduced to the status of the Chandala in modern Europe, and he himself likens his situation as bearing the brunt of that sort of a marginality. He himself had I mean, we should I should clarify, he had resigned from his post of the professor because he felt very uncomfortable or whatever. Like he felt extremely sidelined in the academic structure of his time. He felt that writing independently would be a better thing for him. So so that's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is, of course, the figure of the priest. And you've put your finger on an extremely important point here, because for instance, in the second chapter, where I'm trying to outline a Nietzschean theory or a Nietzschean interpretation of untouchability by using certain concepts from Nietzsche, and trying to think about the phenomenon of untouchability in India. The figure of the priest is extremely important because Nietzsche names the priest in several occasions, and he names the Brahmin in a couple of occasions, where he says that the priest is a kind of a powerless figure who invents psychological devices. So a priest is essentially different from other kinds of historical figures, like a military commander or a scholar or an industrialist or a politician or something like that. What does the priest do? The priest essentially invents psychological categories, which are always already categories of manipulation. So the Christian priest invented categories like sin, guilt, salvation, etc., to dominate a certain part of the believer's own being or the believer's own way of thinking. And I take that insight to be extremely important in the way Ambedkar himself describes the figure of the priest in India, for example. So where are notions of purity pollution really coming from? Where are ideas of the hierarchy between social classes, the supremacy of the Brahmin in this cosmic state of things? Where are all these ideas coming from, or at least who is legitimizing these ideas in the popular realm? So the priest as the inventor of psychological devices who exercises a certain power through these powerless, I mean, quote unquote, powerless psychological devices is something that I found to be extremely interesting in the way, that I would not go to the extent of saying that, okay, this is exactly where they meet together. But yes, I am indeed willing to recognize that there is that sort of a recognition from Ambedkar himself that the priest is doing something really different from, or the priest is exercising power in a highly different way vis-a-vis someone like a military commander who will exercise power through a certain brute violence. So untouchability actually can be described as a form of causing injury without touching, without direct contact, without explicit bloodshedding, explicit violence. So that is exactly something that uh, 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 a philosophical attention towards both these thinkers enables us to do. That is what it enables us to see when we are trying to analyze even our society.
And yeah, so one thing that like I haven't got the final part of your work, obviously, because that you're still, it's a work in progress. It's still
Yes.
happening. You're still writing it, you're still editing it. So I just wanted to know one thing, and you can tell us all about this, is what exactly is the Ambedkarite or Ambedkar's, thought of Nietzsche? Like, what does Ambedkar himself think about Nietzsche's project, right? Because from what I received, there's a section on Nietzsche and a section on Ambedkar, but there's not a section on Ambedkar thinking about Nietzsche. Obviously, Nietzsche can't think about Ambedkar because they lived in different times. But what is Ambedkar thinking about Nietzsche? What is he writing about Nietzsche? And how does that serve to counter the kind of force that Nietzschean thought has, the kind of anti-egalitarianism that Nietzschean thought has, and that in a certain sense still carries today, right? Because people would still want to say that, oh, you want to give reservations to people, and that'll just bring down merit. That's the argument still being made now, right? Like, people are still making the same argument. It's not exactly a Nietzschean argument, but you can see there's similarities there, right? So what is Ambedkar's response to Nietzsche? What exactly, and how do you see it coming? Like, how does it affect the way that you are seeing this confluence or this antagonism between them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, because the entirety of the sixth chapter is about exactly this point. How does Ambedkar read Nietzsche? So very briefly, the references to Nietzsche occur in three or four of Ambedkar's works, and all of them are Ambedkar's late works, and most of them have been unpublished and were posthumously published and so on. So the bulk of Ambedkar's reference to Nietzsche concerns his reading of the Manusmriti, and Ambedkar is trying to point out that Nietzsche's reading of the Manusmriti is inaccurate on these points. So one very interesting point that, of course, Ambedkar highlights is that Nietzsche thought that the Manusmriti is actually very fair and very, this is the word Nietzsche used, gentle towards women. And Ambedkar cites several verses from the Manusmriti to point out that this point is completely misunderstood by Nietzsche. And I want to point okay, I'll come to that later, the reason for Nietzsche's misunderstanding itself. But yeah, so Ambedkar is trying to do this, so he's trying to read Nietzsche's misinterpretation, is trying to point out the flaws in it. So that's the first part. Why he's doing that is because Nietzsche was already gaining a sort of a positive reception amongst the conservative or the reactionary thinkers of early 20th century. So there are several such thinkers, and I try to analyze them in the 6th chapter. SR or Ahitagni Rajwade was one such person who translated Nietzsche's Antichrist into Marathi. And he was a great champion of Nietzsche's ideas in Western India. And himself was a Brahmin priest, of course. So he was positively influenced. Tilak was positively influenced by Nietzsche. Savarkar, through Tilak's influence, was positively influenced by not Nietzsche as such, but the whole fascist connection between Mussolini, Hitler, and Nietzsche. So there's that whole context of Nazi appropriation of Nietzsche, which comes slightly dilutedly, but it nonetheless comes through to Savarkar. So there's this whole context of 20th century intellectual history where a lot of conservative thinkers are positively using Nietzsche to argue against the anti-caste movement or the non-Brahmin movement. And what are they exactly arguing against? They're saying that, oh, look, a great or a very famous Western thinker has praised our most ancient law book, the Manusmriti. So because of that validation, how could these people, question the theological and political basis of what the Manusmriti advocate? You see that sort of a Western validation occurring even today, where Hindutva scholars regularly depend on Western on the validation of Western scholars to say that, okay, since they have validated certain of our texts and forms of thinking, whatever form of resistance, whether intellectual or political, that is coming against this dominant tradition of Brahminism, that can be discounted. But yeah, let me not go into that. So yeah, so Ambedkar's reading of Nietzsche occurs in this particular intellectual environment where he's trying to point out the dangers of the positive reception of Nietzsche in India. So that is the first part. And the usual story also ends there. Okay, Ambedkar, Nietzsche misunderstood the Manusmriti. Ambedkar pointed to its flaws. But again, this is something that my title also intends to foreground. Why does Ambedkar use the term gospel of the Superman? So even as Ambedkar is criticizing Nietzsche's misinterpretation of the Manusmriti, he still thinks that the concept of the Superman or the Übermensch that he borrows from the work of Nietzsche is extremely useful for analyzing Hindu society. So he describes Hinduism as the gospel of the Superman. That's the phrase that I use in the title. So that's what is interesting for me, and that's what I try to analyze. Even if Ambedkar found Nietzsche to be incorrect when reading the Manusmriti, there are still certain resources available within Nietzsche's own writings, which Nietzsche himself does not realize, that are useful for description or analysis or exegesis or etc., which a careful reader like Ambedkar realizes. So he uses Nietzsche against Nietzsche himself, and he uses Nietzsche against his own appropriation in the conservative circle of modern India. And let me just end it by pointing towards the whole point about the inaccuracy of Nietzsche's reading of the Manusmriti itself. So Nietzsche, of course, as we know, was a philologist, a very highly trained philologist who worked on classical documents from antiquity of various parts of the world. The name of Zarathustra himself should bring us to some attention about his attention to non-European forms of thinking. So Nietzsche, like other German thinkers of his time, were really invested in reading classical works of Oriental antiquity. And two of the earliest translations of the Manusmriti were done by Germans. So one German translation was done by Johann Christian Huttner, and the other English translation was, of course, done by Georg Bühler, which Ambedkar also relies upon for his own analysis. So, but it is interesting that Nietzsche does not read the Manusmriti in the more reliable German and English translation. Rather, he reads the Manusmriti in a French translation. It's also interesting who did this translation. So this French translation was done by this colonial bureaucrat, this French colonial bureaucrat called Louis Jacoliot, who was based in Pondicherry. So there is also this very important, interesting history of how the Manusmriti itself reaches Nietzsche's hands. it is through this French colonial officer who goes to Chandarnagar in Bengal, retrieves a Sanskrit copy of the Manusmriti from some Pandit, gets it translated, and then that is published in Europe. So Nietzsche is reading this translation of the Manusmriti, which now most of Indology has thoroughly discredited. It was an extremely inaccurate translation of the Manusmriti itself. So that is one of the main reasons for why Nietzsche's own understanding of the Manusmriti is extremely flawed in so many respects. So we should also not, that's my sort of plea, that we should also not place Nietzsche as an extremely bad reader. He was an extremely insightful reader of so many other texts, and it was maybe not his fault exactly that he got an extremely defective translation of the Manusmriti in French, which he relied upon mainly for his own purposes. But yes, I do admit that even with this flawed translation, he has done something with the Manusmriti which no other Western thinker or no other Occidental thinker has done in the past. So again, I want to point out this one small tidbit. One of Nietzsche's closest friends was Paul Deussen, who was himself an Indologist and an expert in the Vedas. So Paul Deussen was a friend of Vivekanand, and Vivekanand himself was, a deep reader of Schopenhauer, who was himself, someone who influenced Nietzsche. So there is again this whole circle of how Nietzsche was proving to be influential amongst a certain tradition of thinking, which already places a lot of value on Hindu or Brahmanical works of antiquity. And Nietzsche is sort of intervening into this work of thinking. But this is something that a lot of his conservative readers might themselves find intolerable in a way, what he does with the category of the Chandala and so.
And this is very interesting because I did not know these details that you brought up, because there is, I have had a suspicion that a lot of the reception of Western thought that has happened in India over the last 100 or 150 years has not really been the reception of, British philosophy, but of German philosophy. So German philosophy has influenced, Indian nationalist or Indian colonialist thought in a very, very peculiar way. Like, it's a very indirect way, like you said. It's not directly, because German was never a language that was either read or spoken in India at any point of time. And like in any kind of, I don't think of the great, the figures that you can think of, perhaps only Muhammad Iqbal was the only one who knew German. None of the others knew German at all, right? So, but even then, these figures like Schopenhauer, Hegel, Nietzsche, these people have influenced so much of Indian colonial thought that it's actually something that has been completely left, unsaid. And that's also strange, because Germany did not colonize India. Germany was not the colonial power. So yeah, this kind of thing these kind of things that come up when you think about Nietzsche and his own master Schopenhauer and all of these people, what happens is that we have to then completely reevaluate what it is, or the entire basis of Indian thinking before independence. That is what happens, because once you understand that people like Tilak, Savarkar, Vivekanand, Ambedkar himself, they were all reading Western thinkers, and especially German thinkers, then that means that we also have to go back into those, into those discourses, into those texts. And I think what you're doing is something that is like, it should have happened much earlier, but I'm at least glad it's happening now, right? That somebody is taking the time and putting in the effort to go back into these, to kind of do what Ambedkar did, like kind of an archaeology of Indian thought, right? And this is something that I feel like, for example, Nietzsche's interface, or Nietzsche's antagonism with Ambedkar that you are trying to bring out, it also opens up so many questions that are not just about historical or political relevance. They're also ontological questions. And you yourself, I think, in one of your chapters, you mentioned that untouchability is not really something that can be thought of in empirical terms. It's not just okay a practice that some people have, some quaint practice that people have. It is something much more than that. And so if Nietzsche has a kind of ontological perspective on things, then Ambedkar also, in his antagonism with Nietzsche, also has to construct a kind of an alternative ontological perspective, right? And so how do you see that turning out?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, because I'm also working on, like, in the first part I tried to bring Nietzsche's thought to bear on the question of untouchability, and towards the end of the book, I'm trying to bring Ambedkar's thought to bear on thinking differently about the question of untouchability. So yes, of course, I take this distinction between ontic and ontological um, from the work of Martin Heidegger. And let us not get bogged down by big words. What this distinction implies is actually something very simple. And Heidegger himself explains it in this way, that when one asks, when one studies works of literature in a department devoted to literary studies, those are, ontic kinds of investigations. But when one is asking the question, what is literature itself, then that becomes an ontological question. And he thinks that philosophy is that mode of inquiry which by right asks these ontological questions. So of course we've had several inquiries into untouchability, and it is also possible to offer ontic answers to ontological questions. So when we are asking the question, what is untouchability itself, that becomes an ontological question. And it is my claim, and I mean, please, I guess, take my claim with a certain pinch of salt or grain of salt, I don't know, whatever the expression is, that disciplinary perspectives from, say, anthropology, sociology, history, political science, economics, etc., have all offered ontic answers to the question of untouchability. But I think we have not done enough work on what can be an ontological response, or what can be an ontological investigation into the problem of untouchability as such. And I think there is a lot of stuff in Nietzsche's works and Ambedkar's works that really brings this ontological understanding of untouchability to the fore. So what do I exactly mean by that? Again, this is something that I'm working on, and that you will see that towards the end of the in the last 7th chapter of the book. So this is a statement from Ambedkar's book Untouchables, or the Children of India's Ghetto, which is of course published posthumously. And this is Ambedkar's statement, quote, "Caste has made the Hindus inhuman and the untouchables subhuman. As long as caste persists, there is no escape to either. From either is the important word here. There is no escape to either from the established order of the subhuman and the inhuman," end of quote. So I think this statement of Ambedkar is as close to an ontological understanding of untouchability that we have, because Ambedkar's statement fundamentally implicates the notions of being, space, time, etc., which most other ontic inquiries into untouchability, which focus on humiliation, discrimination, segregation, exclusion, etc., these things are not able to bring to the fore. So yeah, I think there is a certain imperative to think about untouchability differently, and I think Ambedkar's and Nietzsche's writings do enable that sort of investigation.
Great. I think we can open up to questions now.
Yeah, sure.
Up to everyone. If anyone has any questions for both Huzaifa and Ankit. Well, I had a question, so I'll begin. The use of the term Chandala morality by Nietzsche, and its contrast with his the more popular term, which is slave morality. That kind of reminded me of how Ambedkar also studied slavery and untouchability as different, the difference between them. So is there a difference in politics in how politics and ontology, whatever, in how Nietzsche uses these two terms, or is he just using them synonymously? Or does he realize the difference between the two in any way?
Uh, so far as I have read and understood, I think there is a great deal of interchangeability in the way that Nietzsche uses the word slave and the Chandala, except for all those references where Nietzsche sees a certain positive import to the category of the Chandala, where I pointed out that there are certain aesthetic and artistic values that he still sees, as belonging to the figure of the Chandala in modern Europe. So that's the Nietzsche part. Ambedkar, especially, very, very forcefully makes that distinction between the slave and the untouchable. In fact, making that argument that untouchability as a form of oppression is far more cruel and insidious than slavery. And again, I think context is really important in understanding this whole distinction that Ambedkar himself made, because at the time of Ambedkar, at the time of Ambedkar's writing, there were several thinkers like Lala Lajpat Rai, even Nehru in his Discovery of India, where he said that, okay, Hindus were at least better in that they did not make Dalits their slaves, or at least that we did not, have a slave economy in our country, which was factually also incorrect, because people like Sanal Mohan's deep study of slavery in India has really showed that slave labor, slave economy did exist in India. But yeah, so it is in this context that several people were making the claims that, okay, Hindus should at least be morally more gratified, because they did not come up with such a brute form of oppression like slavery, and instead came up with a more gentle, less harmful form of oppression, which is something like untouchability. So Ambedkar is really making that distinction in this intellectual environment, where it's saying that an indirect and more psychologically ingrained form of oppression is far more long-lasting and far more antiquarian and far more cruel, in fact, than these more direct and brutal forms of oppression, which directly result in bloodshed and so on and so forth. So that's the first part. The second part is again very interesting, because even as Ambedkar makes this distinction between the untouchable and the slave, the term slavery itself acquires a very, the word slavery is used by Ambedkar in a heuristic sort of a way. So Ambedkar describes Brahminism in one of his speeches as, quote unquote, the thought of slavery. And again, this is something that I try to analyze in the last chapter of this work. Why does Ambedkar describe a ruling ideology, an ideology of the ruling class, as something that symbolizes slavery? Because masters and slaves are supposed to be, on the surface at least, it's supposed to be an antagonistic category, right? So how can a ruling ideology itself symbolize servility and slavishness and lack of courage? All of these notions are something that I think are extremely fruitful and are extremely germane for even understanding Nietzsche's whole opposition to slave morality. So slave morality is problematic because it gives into feelings of weakness, pity, self-harm, and so on and so forth. So the heuristic usage of slavery that Ambedkar makes towards the end of his life is extremely interesting in bringing towards what can be called, and this is what I also call it in the title of the 8th chapter, how Brahminism is a slave morality. How Brahminism is a morality that fundamentally sanctions servility, both amongst its supposed masters as well as its supposed slaves. So yeah.
Anand, anything for you?
I just had this thing when you're talking about these incredible journeys that texts make through misreadings. Somebody sitting in Pondicherry mistranslates something, we misread it, to completely misunderstand it. It also reminds me of how Ambedkar often misreads Hindu texts to draw a point, and then you realize that at that, for instance, he had no access to the critical edition of Mahabharata. Let's start there. He had no access to Jataka tales we learn from Chandraban. I didn't know that. Faustball's translations. See, all these, Faustball should have been another German. All these Germans from Max Muller's time to everybody just like wading in here. And of course, there were Manusmriti owes to another white man who's British, not necessarily for its revival and its modern journey. And you also begin your work by looking at how Nick Dirk says something, and then how Patrick Olivier, this Indologist versus those who are dependent on what Aijaz Ahmed wonderfully called colonial discourse analysis people, तो ये material है तो इसको पढ़ो. So not going beyond that. Whereas Ambedkar clearly proposes a challenge to all this. In between all this is these mistranslations and misreadings and a way of doing comparative politics. So I'm also using this in the sense in which Shaumibrata Chaudhary uses it, in terms of saying, how do you compare incomparable things and look at events, look at pronouncements, statements, declarations, and again misread them. So often in a biography of Ambedkar, which is forthcoming from Navana, we also find that Ambedkar cherry picks. He would take, for instance, a right-wing, not a a political philosopher, what do you call him, Edmund Burke. So the fascination for the right in Europe, for me, what I was gleaning from reading your work in progress and from your presentation today and from Huzaifa's questioning is this. So there are misreadings of what could be, and then to take this Chandala and to see a romantic figure there. Again, reminds me of what Ginsberg coming here, going to Banaras, smoking some weed, and then thinking that Vedic chanting is a way of resist non-violence. Right? These kind of misreadings are rife. So how do you manage to further misread them? Because yours is, again, you have the benefit of reading Wendy Doniger to Vivekananda to, XYZ, and of being in a moment which Huzaifa has characterized as subcontinental philosophy, right? In this way of looking at, and Ambedkar as a Europeanist. If Ambedkar is a Europeanist, as per Shomo, then what is Nietzsche? Indianist of a certain kind, of a certain completely because again it's a way of Ambedkar misreading Nietzsche is what I've been always told. He doesn't know how to read Nietzsche. So how do you situate your reading between a field of misreadings, deliberate and accidental, both? You really cannot say one from the other sometimes.
I mean, when it comes to misreadings, I always follow this one principle. It's laid down by Heidegger in his book, What is Called Thinking. He had very, I think, nicely said there that Kant, Immanuel Kant, would get a straight F in his historical comprehension of Plato and Aristotle. But it is Kant and only Kant who has creatively transformed Plato and Aristotle for modern Europe. And I think that is something that is very true for Nietzsche's reading of the Manusmriti and perhaps even Ambedkar's reading of Nietzsche as well. Maybe by some standards of historical comprehension, both of these thinkers might, receive a straight F in terms of how they have textually and historically comprehended the content of the writings of these thinkers. But to my mind, only Nietzsche in the Western canon and only Ambedkar in the Indian canon, so to say, have creatively transformed the text of the Manusmriti in a way that is enduring enough for us to still return to them for philosophical food for thought. So I think that is, so again, the great obsession about historical correctness is also something that belongs to, I mean, again, maybe I'm making slightly provocative remarks or something, but I think that obsession also belongs to a certain kind of a historian who is concerned with getting their facts right. But the kind of work that I want to do and the kind of work that I see myself doing is beginning from this factual element to thinking about certain more imaginative connections that these thinkers may not have made themselves, which might somewhat fall outside the purview of a purely historicist sort of an investigation, and which might be more fruitfully studied and analyzed in more theoretical contexts, which which a purely historical inquiry may not allow. So I think these are some of the ways in which I myself try to navigate the field of, and the layers upon layers upon layers of readings and misreadings that exists between all these three figures.
One thing I found really fascinating was the passage about, the transhuman nature of politics that is required, and like how animals are also implicated in the caste order. So the term transhuman itself, like the way of reading Nietzsche in the West, so to speak, like with Deleuze and so on, has like transcended the humanist plane so much. But like reading thinkers like Ambedkar, like doing the politics which are transhuman in a way, it's like kind of we still have a lot of work to do here. So how do we do that? That's the big question. Like, what do you think?
That's interesting, and I have myself done some work on this, trying to think about the field of what is called animal studies, and try to bring it into conversation with what might be called Dalit studies or something like that, using Ambedkar. So what I try to do there is two things. First is, of course, take into account a certain anthropocentrism, that might exist between dominant philosophies that mar our own ways of interpreting human-animal relations in India, for instance. So what I try to do there is foreground Ambedkar's what I try to call Ambedkar's humanism. So again, the statement that I quoted from Untouchables of the Children of India's Ghetto, caste has made the caste has made the touchable inhuman and the untouchable subhuman. Between this order of inhumanity and subhumanity, there is no escape. So caste, the order of caste is already something that results into incomplete or unfulfilled or morally stunted human beings. So what does transhumanism mean in a context where the rights of humanity itself are not accorded to a great mass of population? I think that is somewhere with which, that is one starting point with which I myself begin, by looking at, for instance, the notion of caste as jati itself. So jati is often translated as species, and I take the translation very seriously, because the word jati really does imply that there are that something that the word class somewhat misses, because there really is that sort of species level of granular hierarchy that Brahminism wants to instill amongst different classes of people, between Brahmins and Kshatriyas and untouchables and so on. And how does that imagination of speciesism within a social order goes to the classification of animals as well? So in the second chapter, I'm glad you noticed, I also wrote this sentence where I said, not only humans, but even animals shall have to be emancipated from the classificatory order of untouchability. Because, of course, Kanchaila has worked extensively on this. Why is it that the cow is placed at such a high level of respect, dignity, divination, etc., in the Brahmanic Hindu imagination, at the cost of all other animals? Buffalo is not there, any other animal is not there, only the cow is made the sacred. So, and of course, there is ample literature from the Manusmriti itself, where the Brahmin and the cow are made this sort of theological cognates or theological equivalents. So the Brahmin is the most pure being of the human order, and the cow is the most pure being in the animal kingdom, something like that. So Brahminism wants to classify even animals on the basis of purity and impurity, whose slaughter is supposed to give you the rights of killing another human being. That is really signified by the problem of this cow lynching that we see in contemporary India as well. The killing of no other animal is going to, invite death upon the most vulnerable people, Dalits and Muslims, other than the cow. So the question of transhumanism always already takes into this extreme and granular classification that Brahminism has achieved within both the human and the animal worlds in India. And I have done that work in more detail at some other essay, and try to and I've tried to sort of refer to that in the second chapter as well. Yeah.
That's great. Any more questions from anyone? That's it, I guess.
Chandraban, you want to kindle the pot?
Yeah, I was thinking about something which I want to share with Ankit, and if he can respond to that. So basically, when we do this ancient history, we think about Orientalism. So all these European scholars, especially German scholars, uh, widely interested in ancient texts. So Max Muller was the editor of Sacred Book of the East series, and so on. It begins with Max Muller, and it goes on. So and what we notice is that um, interestingly, they are in a way valorizing the texts, ancient Indian texts. On the other hand, I'm informed by you only that they are critical of their Nietzsche is critical of the Christianity in a way. So they are searching for a distant world which they are getting in the ancient text, and then they are picking certain things valorizing. And then interestingly, later on, nationalist historians used the same Orientalist writings to argue the same. So this connection is interesting. I don't have a question, but I just wanted to share this thing. And if you can speak more on this, what is happening because of this Oriental scholarship developed in Europe during 19th and 20th century, 18th and 19th century primarily.
Yeah, I mean, this is very important because as I also tried to point out, that there was a huge deal of study going on amongst German scholars about say ancient Indian texts, and some bit was I mean, I think it's safe to say that a large part of scholarly consensus amongst these German scholars was a certain valorization of ancient Hindu texts, and its most immediate effect could be seen in how the right-wing thinkers of 19th and 20th century immediately lapped that sort of a validation up. So from Vivekanand to Rajwade to Aurobindo, even Bose. I should mention Subhash Chandra Bose was also a keen admirer of Nietzsche's writings. We should also explain his political affiliation with the Nazis and so on and so forth. I mean, I don't have the time to go into that. But yeah, there is this big German-Indian connection, which is mediated by Oriental high antiquity and the texts of Brahmanic antiquity, where one sees a sort of an alliance between the ruling classes there and the ruling classes here. Of course, Dorothy Figueira has very deftly analyzed this confluence through the whole motif of the Aryan that was developed in 19th and 20th, which of course has had a lot of Nazi misappropriation as well. So I think it is around these. So I'll just end this with pointing out that perhaps only Ambedkar is someone who takes this relationship critically. So insofar as, of course, I mean, you must have also noticed that he does use Max Muller's works critically to challenge a lot of the notions put forward by the votaries of Brahminism. So that is a very different kind of a use made of the Indologist Max Muller as compared to the people like Vivekananda and Tilak and so on and so forth, who are reading them for different purposes. In fact, even P.V. Kane, like the author of the History of Dharma Shastras, is very positively in the sense that he quotes a lot from the 5-volume history of Dharma Shastras to counter Brahmanic claims made by modern authors. So I think there is a certain way of using these sources even for anti-caste purposes, even if largely speaking these this Indology scholarship has mostly in a way has mostly been blind to a sort of an anti-caste perspective towards ancient India as such. So yeah.
There's another question for you. It's in the chat. AD writes, could you talk a bit more about other animals and the Manusmriti in other Brahminical texts?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. Because okay, if you want to know more, okay, so this is the edition of the Manusmriti translated by Patrick Olivelle, and it has a very useful appendix at the end, which is titled Fauna and Flora. So this is here, and you can see Fauna and Flora. So I really like this whole compendium of all the non-human entities that are referred to in the Manusmriti. And there are various sorts of animals and a lot of like which shrub can be eaten, which shrub cannot be eaten, which animal can be eaten, which animal cannot be eaten. So there is a great deal of ritual economy of non-human entities or non-human beings in a text like the Manusmriti, which should be of interest to anybody interested in the scholarship of animal studies and so on. So one thing that I find very interesting, and I also try to analyze it in my work on the intersection between animal studies and caste studies or Dalit studies, is the notion of punishment. So it's very interesting that the Manusmriti has certain sections where it advocates different kinds of punishments for killing different animals. So not the killing. So again, Brahmanism has not had an equal reverence for all animals. Let us also note that very, very crucially. It only values the cow. Other animals are slightly more disposable. So the punishment for killing a cow and the Brahmin is the same in the Manusmriti. This is very, very important. And it's the highest punishment, death penalty. So death penalty is to be given to anybody who kills a Brahmin or a cow, because both are the highest valued entities in the Brahmanic imagination. And what sort of punishment is given to those who kill smaller animals like insects or smaller human beings like the Shudras? The punishment is very lenient. And I wanted to point this out as well. Ambedkar deals with this point extensively in his own writings on modern constitutional law. He says that that Hindu jurisprudence or Brahmanic jurisprudence essentially offers different kinds of punishments based on the identity of the accused. And what more glaring justification of Ambedkar's statement could be given apart from what we are literally witnessing before our own eyes? People who, I don't know, give rape threats to women are let off in a matter of days, and people who spoke of love are still languishing in jail and so on. So the identity of the victim is extremely important in the kind of punishment that is meted to them, whether the victim is a human or an animal. That really is brought forth in the Manusmriti, and the whole principle of Ambedkar's jurisprudence and Ambedkar's whole efforts, legislative efforts, constitutional efforts, is to negate or counter these customary and legal effects of Hindu jurisprudence, whereby punishments are given absolutely arbitrarily, not based on any rational grounds, based on the identity of the victims, not based on the severity of the crimes and so on and so forth. I mean, it's an absolutely irrational system, but it exists and it persists, and we are seeing it in front of our eyes even today.
Any more questions from anyone? Coral, do you have anything to say?
How I'm still a little like grappling with the theories, so that's all. But I really think this is fascinating. I did have a question about, you had a chapter about Ambedkar's methodology about like clearing the ground as a way of reading and understanding, and I wanted to ask about that, but I don't know if we have enough time. So
Yeah, quick question. You can just
Quick
finish
answer.
on that. Yeah.
yeah, so this is actually, I was thinking about, it reminded, I don't know if you were there for Chandrakan's talk, but he talked about this method of like going back to the primary source. And I remember, I think it was in your proposal, you talked about clearing the ground in terms of like an archaeological method as well. And I found that really interesting. So could you talk a little more about that?
I mean, Ambedkar himself uses this term, clearing of the ground. And he says that whenever one begins to inquire into the question of the origin of untouchability, what is that sort of ground that one sees? And this is a very good metaphor for describing not only the textual resources upon which one might depend upon, when one is answering this question, but also the other literally archaeological material. So Ambedkar very beautifully puts this metaphor of how an archaeologist sifts away the rubble from the ground in order to find something of historical import, which is hidden beneath the rubble that exists above the ground. So an inquiry into the understanding, an inquiry into the origin of untouchability requires that comportment of an archaeologist who has that sifting approach towards a lot of textual references which will not yield a direct answer to who the untouchables were and why did they become untouchables in history. So that is an extremely powerful metaphor that is used by Ambedkar. And of course that if I can say that, I mean, I don't know, 50 years before Foucault wrote The Archaeology of Knowledge, Ambedkar himself was putting forward that whole idea that it is only through archaeology that one can understand and one can foreground extremely shifty and extremely hidden in plain sight sort of questions like the origin of untouchability, about which we still have very less convincing answers. So yeah, very quick answer to that.
Thank you so much for taking the time to answer that. I really appreciate it.
Great. So we'll end there.
Sure.
This is
Yeah.
also our last Dalit History Month event, and the rest of the fellows will be talking to will be in May. So it will be like our own Dalit History Month. But
Yeah, but at Navyana, every month is Dalit History Month.
yes,
Din
I was
din
so
din
sorry.
Bhim. No, I said every day Bhim. So din Bhim. So yeah, we have had 4 fellows talking through this month, and we also sandwiched a memoir of a Savarna woman in between, the right and the middle. We've had 5 events, and what is wonderful is the explosion of events everywhere. Every university, more universities abroad strangely celebrate this than universities here, and they more formally, more properly, and the presence of people like Suraj Jengade and people working with Dalit Lives Matter, Tenmoyi Soundarraj and others, it's kind of galvanized into something else altogether right now. And our own Navyana Dalit History Fellowships couldn't have but happened. People said, why now? Why you didn't do it 10 years? Some kind of a momentum, these kind of books, these kind of projects are knocking at the door. So thank you, all of you. Yeah, we've had 20 people sometimes, 30 people sometimes, 10 people sometimes. But it's more the quality of these, and also the fact that we're all sitting far away. We want to meet Ankit, but we can't. I think Huzaifa, you're still in.
I'm in Delhi.
You're back in Delhi. Okay. So we could possibly meet Huzaifa.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. We planned, and then this
I
pandemic.
think I'll meet Ankit when I go to Pune.
Oh yeah,
Hopefully.
that
If
would
you
be
are
lovely.
still in
This is
Pune.
a nice way to tell me you're going to Pune. Okay.
No, I'm not. Yeah.
When they go to Pune. Okay, so let's see whether you go to Pune first or whether Ankit. Yeah, too hot in Delhi, he says.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. Very hot.
So yeah, I mean, and also thanks Ankit for probably somebody who is close to finishing the manuscript ahead of others in this thing. It's not a race. No, not at all. No prizes for finishing first, we're telling you right now. So we're looking forward to seeing all this through very soon. We will pester Aishwari Kumar and others to, अरे भाई एक ही चैप्टर नहीं पढ़ा, हम तो पूरा किताब खत्म कर रहे, क्या कर रहे हो तुम Aishwari Kumar? So we'll get on his case and
Ashwari also writing something for you.
no, he is supposed to be one of the interlocutors, so to say. So one of the respondents. So now you are in the position of one as well, Huzaifa. So we're making it kind of a work in progress peer review. So we before we even present it to, we are hoping to publish as many of these books internationally if possible. To with university presses abroad, and not to think of it as a project that is limited to India. So we will see. We'll see. The promise I can make is Navyana is definitely publishing it, but our ambitions are quite high for all these projects. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Alex,
Huzaifa, for
Coral, Huzaifa.
giving so
I
much
also
time
want to
for
thank
writing.
Huzaifa. Yeah, especially.
Thank you for inviting me and having me
Yeah.
read so much
Yeah.
interesting work by Ankit. So I actually to make a acquaintance with Ankit also, because otherwise
Yes.
you just a pass by.
Yeah, now you know who you were passing by. Huh?
Yeah,
Yes.
that's
Yeah.